The House Committee on Oversight and Accountability holds the decennial census should collect information about the citizenship status of our population. It is a basic data point that should be available to policymakers and the public, and adding a citizenship question on the decennial census questionnaire is the best way to obtain accurate information. This is now even more necessary given the Biden administration's failure to, quote, take care that the laws be faithfully executed, close quote, when it comes to enforcing immigration law. Under this administration, we've not only witnessed a failure to enforce the law against millions of illegal aliens, but affirmative actions to abuse limited statutory authority to parole over 1 million inadmissible aliens into the United States. If H.R. 7109 is not passed into law, these millions of illegal aliens will be counted for purposes of apportionment, eroding the one-person, one-vote principle. And in the long line of cases that deal with census and apportionment, the term that the courts have consistently used is when you erode the one-person, one-vote, they've used the term debasing the vote of the people.
For all of you members who like to follow precedent, every apportionment since 1790 has included every single person residing in the United States, not just those lucky enough to be given the right to vote. This bill is an affront to the great radical Republicans who wrote the original Constitution and the 14th Amendment, which has always made persons, not voters, the basis for reapportionment. The census is essential to democracy, just as the framers endorsed Tom Paine's common sense, they endorsed a common census. This bill would destroy the accuracy of the census, which may have something to do with its real legislative motivation. In the 2010 census, the undercount of Hispanic U.S. citizens was 1.4%, but in 2020, that number grew to 5%. Many observers credit that 300% plus jump to the last administration's attempt to add a citizenship question to the census and all of the publicity and rumor surrounding that attempt. The addition of a question about citizenship will deter many immigrants, not only the undocumented, but persons with green cards and people who are U.S. citizens from completing the census.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for his statement.
Chairman Burgess, thank you very much. Always a delight to be back in the Rules Committee. We could do what the gentleman from Arizona invites us to do, but it would be completely unconstitutional. The last president tried to include a citizenship question on the decennial census in 2020 and to count only U.S. citizens in the census, as this legislation would do, and it failed for completely obvious reasons. Section 2 of the 14th Amendment states that apportionment of seats in the House is based on a count of, quote, the whole number of persons in each state, unquote, persons being the all-encompassing category larger than that of citizens or voters. When the framers wanted to impose a citizenship requirement, they sure knew how to do it. For example, when they said that the president must be a born U.S. citizen and not a naturalized citizen. Some people think that was because Thomas Jefferson was moving to block Alexander Hamilton from running for president. But in any event, it's right in the Constitution, just like it says we, as members of the House, we have to be U.S. citizens for at least 7 years, which is why if you've been naturalized in the last 3 or 4 years, you can't do it. The Supreme Court has been perfectly clear about this and made this point emphatically in a unanimous 2016 decision called Evanwell versus Abbott. And like this legislation itself, Evanwell involved a challenge to congressional apportionment based on a total count of the entire population instead of just a count of the voter population. But Justice Ginsburg held for the unanimous court that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, quote, retained total population as the congressional apportionment base. She cited the speech made by Senator Jacob Howard upon introduction of Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. Quote, he said, the basis of representation is numbers. The committee adopted numbers as the most just and satisfactory basis, and this is the principle upon which the Constitution itself was originally framed, that the basis of representation should depend upon numbers. And such, I think, after all, is the safest and most secure principle upon which the government can rest. Numbers, not voters. Numbers, not property. This is the theory of our Constitution. Justice Ginsburg included lots of decisive legislative authority like this, including the floor statement of Representative James Blaine, who stated that, quote, no one will deny that population is the true basis of representation for women, children, and other non-voting classes may have as vital an interest in the legislation of the country as those who actually deposit the ballot, and therefore they all must be counted. For all of you constitutional textualists out there, the plain reading of the text is clear as day. For all of you constitutional originalists, the original purposes of the passage of the 14th Amendment have been carefully articulated and revisited repeatedly by the Supreme Court and never rebutted by any contrary legislative authority. The 14th Amendment contemplates that representatives serve all residents, not just those eligible to vote. You don't enforce the 14th Amendment under Section 5 by violating the terms of the constitutional amendment. The meaning is indisputable, a point which settles this for anyone who wants to follow the Constitution's text and original public meaning in all cases, not just when the text favors our desired policy outcome. I remember the admonition from the former chairman of this committee, the gentleman from Oklahoma, who would tell us that we should get our work done and not waste time on legislation that will never pass the Senate, never get signed by the president, and certainly never be approved by the Supreme Court. This bill is an affront to the great radical Republicans who wrote the original Constitution and the 14th Amendment, which has always made persons, not voters, the basis for reapportionment. Many non-citizen immigrants who are seeking asylum or are refugees will avoid responding because of uncertainty over their status and fear of arbitrary law enforcement action. Extensive research over the last decade shows that many residents wrongly believe the Census Bureau shares personal responses with other agencies. They don't. Federal law prohibits the sharing of information this way, but that worry has prevented many people from answering questions about immigration status or responding to the census at all. Census data guide the allocation of $2.8 trillion each year in federal assistance to states, localities, and families for a broad range of vital services. An inaccurate census would skew the fair distribution of federal resources for the next decade and deprive many cities and towns in places like Texas and California of needed resources for everything from roads to hospitals and veterans care. I strongly oppose this legislation, Mr. Chairman, which dishonors and violates our Constitution and the values of our nation. I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair, thanks both the witnesses. Mr. Biggs, let me just ask you, is there any response you would like to make to what Mr. Raskin has just put before us?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for that opportunity. So let's consider he's made essentially three arguments. He is essentially claiming that the 14th Amendment requires that every person be counted in the census. This bill doesn't stop that. Then he basically dovetails that into apportionment. And then he uses the argument that was made with regard to women and children, because at the original censuses they were non-voters and so they were covered. Well, what is interesting is when you consider that, is that those women and children have been legal Americans. They were properly and legally here. He wants to apportion based on, literally, by their own admission, 9.2 million. That's what they admit to. Illegal aliens being brought into this country during the term of the Biden administration. He wants those to be figured into the apportionment, which is an interesting position to take.
The most recent report I saw on Epoch Times said before this administration is done, there'll be close to 15 million that are in this country illegally, that we're being paid the price tag, not to mention the cost of the deaths of the Lincoln Riley, of the thousands of young people who are dead because of fentanyl. And this president, this administration is doing this for power and for votes. It's now clear this is why he's doing it. Is there any other reason you can think of?
I can think of a lot of reasons, but I don't know what this president's rationale is. All I know is that he calmly raised his hand saying that, and early on in his presidency urged people to rush the border.
It seems to me a just basic, obligation on our part to say that, yeah, the federal government ought to know the people who are in this country. Are you here? Are you a citizen? Are you here legally? you know, and so forth. And then the policy prescription should flow from that. Again, I understand the argument will be that people are here illegally, they don't want to fill out the forms, they're not going to say they're here, so then you're going to say they're undercounting, so you got people who are here who aren't done, you know, don't have papers, they don't want to answer the question. I get all those arguments, but I'm just saying as a prudential matter as a nation, shouldn't we know who's here? And shouldn't we do that without just guessing? I think that's my question. Either way, yeah, Mr.
Well, no,
Raskin.
but I think you've analyzed it correctly. I think you've got the arguments right. But you're just addressing the first point.
Right.
That this would be optional to do and arguably constitutional to do. And there might be equities on both sides, but appended to it is a clearly unconstitutional provision.
It's a genuine question for a friend. What would be the limiting principle on who is counted? So,
Well, the census has said they don't count people who are, you know, tourists from France who are in town. You've got to be living in the country.
right, but is there a length of time that, you know, and so my point is though, so this, yeah.
Well,
go ahead.
well, domicile, as you know, is defined as physical presence with intention to remain. And maybe there's some grayness around the margins on that, but basically we know people who are physically present and intend to remain.
This is shady for me in terms of my recollection, but I remember certain aspects of the history of this has also to do with not just physical presence, but allegiance and questions involving that. And so whether or not you're here and have allegiance to the United States, or, you know, that those questions are relevant. And certainly we acknowledge that Congress, like in terms of interpreting the question, I mean, Congress has had to deal with figuring out the number of representatives that we have and, you know, make decisions all the time. I mean, it's one person, one vote, but it's 750,000, as effective as 112,000 as it was at one point in time. I just made that number up, but whatever it was at some point mathematically. But my point is just, it clearly there is room for congressional and executive interpretation and application, right, of what in fact it means to be here and be a person counted, and define that, right? And there's and clearly in the past we've asked questions of citizenship, like what, 1830 to 1950 or something like that. So I guess my point is, I don't know that it's absolute that the assertion on the constitutional question, but my point would be, if Congress believes we should do it, we have divisions on that question. If Congress believes that we should do it, I don't see the problem in passing forward something that we believe is, especially if you can argue, if you believe it's clearly unconstitutional, then you have an obligation to vote no. Absolutely. But if you think that there's a legitimate constitutional argument, that you think that you could say that, yeah, I think you can count them under my reading of the Constitution and application of it, and we should at least get the information, send it to the court, or send it to the court, it gets litigated, the court gets it, wherever they come down on the question, then we would just debate whether we amend the Constitution in the absence of that. But is that, I mean, roughly how you gentlemen see it?
That's pretty much how I see it.
Yeah.
When Mr. Biggs said, you know, that there's another provision in the 14th Amendment which allows for reduction of the congressional delegation, that's true. That's if there's disenfranchisement of, at that point, it was the male African-American population, then you could reduce the congressional districts by a proportionate amount. But again, that's written in the Constitution. So, you know, I take your basic point, which is you want to say, if you divide these two parts of the legislation, the first one could be voted on as a matter of policy, and of course we have just a fundamental disagreement about whether that makes any sense to do it and why we would be doing it. I think it's Section 2 that gives the explanation for why it's being done, because they do want to use what's basically an unconstitutional formula for apportioning congressional districts. One that I think, and I appreciate, I know you are a man of principle, Mr. Roy, but I think your state would probably be hurt more than almost any other state in the union by this.
I think we would potentially lose a number of seats. Yes, yeah. What those are, the gentlelady posited 7 seats, I think, or six seats as a possible suggestion, which 4.5 million people, which tells me that we have a firm recognition of how many people are here who are not, who are undocumented and or documented and not citizens. That it is a very large number.
I do think it's rich when with irony, when people claim that the language saying that this is unconstitutional is clear as it can be, but then refuses to use statutory language, even terms of art, on illegal aliens. I find that's rich with irony. I really do. Because, I mean, even Sting understands you have legal aliens and illegal aliens, and that's why in his song, Englishman in New York, he actually uses the term, actually correctly, the term of art, the statutory term. I just had to raise this, just a little cron.
Mr. Raskin, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, well, I agree with my friend from Texas so much, but I guess I just celebrate that fact. I mean, this is the greatest country in the world. Of course everybody wants to come here. I mean, you know, Tom Paine, when he came over from the UK, he fell in love with the promise of America. He said, this land, if it lives up to its values, will be an asylum to humanity.